A 21-year-old Japanese woman named Akiko Takakura was sitting at her desk in the Hiroshima Bank, just 300 meters from ground zero. She was sorting through paperwork, probably thinking about what she'd have for lunch. Above her, 31,000 feet in the sky, a single American B-29 Tinanbon Honantindin bomber carried something that would change everything humanity understood about war. 43 seconds later, Akiko would be one of the few people within a half-mile radius to survive what came next. But this isn't really her story. This is the story of what happened in an underground bunker 400 miles away in Tokyo, when Japan's most powerful military leaders received a fragmentary radio transmission that would shatter every lie they'd been telling themselves for 4 years. What they read in that message would force them to confront a truth so devastating, so absolute, that it would break men who had never admitted defeat in their entire lives. And the truth was this: America hadn't been fighting at full capacity. They had been holding back, and Japan never stood a chance. None of them had started the war. All of them endured its consequences. The Imperial General Headquarters sat 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Reinforced concrete walls, 4 feet thick. On the morning of August 6th, the bunker hummed with the same rhythm it had for months, the managed decline of a losing war. Field Marshal Shinroku Hata was conducting his morning intelligence briefing. These meetings had become ritual theater. Bad news delivered carefully. Strategic adjustments discussed in euphemisms. Everyone knew Japan was losing. No one said it out loud. Then, at precisely 8:15 a.m., the steel door burst open. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, a communications officer who had never, in 15 years of service, entered a room without bowing first, rushed in carrying a decoded transmission. His hands were shaking. He didn't bow. The message was brief, fragmentary, transmitted by the Hiroshima Regional Military Command before all communications ceased. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The transmission ended mid-sentence. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, read the message 3 times. His first thought, his only logical thought, was that the Americans had launched the largest conventional bombing raid in history. Perhaps 500 B-29s, all dropping incendiaries simultaneously. The math seemed impossible otherwise. Hiroshima was a city of 350,000 people spread across 27 square miles. To destroy an entire city would require— He did the calculation in his head. At least 300 bombers, maybe more. It would take hours, multiple waves. But then the follow-up reports started arriving. Weather reconnaissance had tracked the American bombers that morning. Their report was clear, verified by multiple radar stations. 3 B-29s had flown over Hiroshima. Not 300. 3. By noon, reconnaissance pilots attempting to reach Hiroshima were reporting something unprecedented. A mushroom-shaped cloud rising over 40,000 feet, visible from 150 miles away. The cloud glowed with colors they had never seen, purples and oranges that seemed to pulse with internal light. The Supreme War Council convened at 2 p.m. in complete silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, 76 years old, who had survived multiple assassination attempts just for suggesting peace negotiations, read the accumulated reports. His hands trembled as he placed the documents on the table. "Gentlemen," he began, "we must consider what this means." General Korachika Anami, the war minister and the most vocal advocate for fighting to the last citizen, spoke first. "American propaganda," he said firmly. "They want us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. Hiroshima was destroyed by conventional bombing, and they are using deception to... Admiral Toyota interrupted. In normal circumstances, interrupting the war minister would have been unthinkable. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. Our radar tracked them. Our observers watched them. 3. The room fell silent. To understand what these men finally realized in that bunker, you need to understand what they had convinced themselves was true. For 4 years, Japan's military strategy had been built on 3 fundamental beliefs. 3 lies they told themselves. Lies that seemed reasonable, even logical, right up until the moment they weren't. In November 1941, when Japan was planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, Army strategic planners had written extensive documents explaining why Japan could win. These documents, recovered from archives after the war, laid out the logic. Japan would conquer a defensive perimeter so vast that American logistics would collapse under its own weight. Every ship, every aircraft, every bullet would need to travel 5,000 miles across hostile ocean before reaching combat. Japan could sustain its forces from nearby conquered territories, while America exhausted itself trying to supply forces across the Pacific. It seemed so reasonable. And, for the first 6 months of the war, it worked. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with stunning speed. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, all fell in rapid succession. But then came Midway. June 1942. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single day. The official military assessment blamed tactical errors and bad luck. They never mentioned that American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes. They never acknowledged that American industrial capacity meant those 4 carriers could be replaced by the United States, but not by Japan. The underlying assumption that distance would protect them remained intact. Then came Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months of brutal fighting. Japanese forces discovered that Americans could sustain logistics across vast distances, that American troops could match Japanese soldiers in jungle warfare, that American industry could deliver more supplies to a jungle island than Japan could deliver to its own forces. The official assessment blamed local commanders for insufficient fighting spirit. The lie about distance continued. By August 1945, American forces had island-hopped across the Pacific, establishing bases closer and closer to Japan. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island brought American bombers within range of Japanese cities. The protective distance had evaporated. But in that underground bunker, listening to reports about Hiroshima, the military leadership finally understood something more terrifying. Distance didn't matter at all. Japanese military doctrine, could destroy dating back to the 1930s, was built on a fundamental assumption. American society was soft, individualistic, and incapable of sustaining heavy casualties. Americans loved comfort and luxury. They would never endure the sacrifices that war required. Japan's generals had calculated that after losing 30,000 to 40,000 men, American public opinion would demand peace negotiations. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die, to fight to the last man, to launch kamikaze attacks, to charge machine gun nests rather than surrender, would outlast America's willingness to fight. This wasn't just propaganda. Japan's military leadership genuinely believed it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, understood better than anyone how wrong this assumption was. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, toured American factories. In November 1941, right before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wrote to a friend, "Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America." he told his staff, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." He warned Japanese leaders, "To win this war, we would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. Anything less is defeat." His warnings were ignored. Instead, Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as weak materialists who depended on machines because they lacked spiritual strength. Radio broadcasts mocked American soldiers for needing hot showers and fresh food. Japanese newspapers ran cartoons showing soft, overweight American troops fleeing from battle. And for a while, it seemed to work. American forces in the Philippines retreated. Early naval battles were inconclusive. The casualties were mounting, but American society didn't break. Instead, something happened that Japanese leaders had never anticipated. America got angry. After Pearl Harbor, American industrial production didn't just increase, it exploded. Factories that had been making cars started making tanks. Shipyards that had been building cargo vessels started building warships. Aircraft manufacturers hired women to work assembly lines 24 hours a day. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real. Millions of American women flooded into factories, taking jobs that had always been reserved for men. They built the ships, planes, and weapons that would defeat Japan. By 1943, the United States was producing more military equipment in a month than Japan produced in a year. Not because Americans were more spiritual or more dedicated, but because American society could mobilize industrial capacity on a scale Japan couldn't comprehend. And the casualties. By August 1945, the United States had lost over 100,000 service members in the Pacific War. American public opinion hadn't collapsed. If anything, it had hardened. In that bunker, reading reports about a single bomb destroying an entire city, Japan's military leaders finally confronted the truth. They had fundamentally misunderstood American society. Americans weren't weak. They were patient. And they had been building weapons in secret while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. This wasn't just military doctrine. It was woven into Japanese culture, education, and national identity. The idea that fighting spirit, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful. One Japanese pilot equaled 3 American pilots because Japanese pilots had superior training and fighting spirit. One Japanese soldier could defeat 4 American soldiers because Japanese soldiers fought with total commitment. Superior tactics and strategy could overcome numerical inferiority. These assumptions had been tested and found wanting at every single engagement of the Pacific War. Yet Japan's high command had consistently reinterpreted defeats as validation of their theories, needing minor adjustments rather than fundamental revision. Intelligence Colonel Hideaki Sato had been compiling data since 1941. His calculations were terrifyingly accurate. In the afternoon meeting on August 6th, he finally presented what he called the Reality Assessment, a document his team had compiled over 6 months, but had been prevented from presenting until now. The numbers were devastating. American aircraft production in 1944 alone exceeded Japan's total production for the entire war. American shipyards were building escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly off them. American ammunition. Factories produced more shells in a week than Japan's factories produced in a month. But Sato's most damning statistics involved scientific research. His intelligence network had documented American research facilities employing over 130,000 scientists and engineers working on military technology. Japan's comparable effort employed approximately 6,000 talent. American research universities, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago, had larger physics departments than Japan's entire scientific community. The atomic bomb Sato explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Required facilities that we could not have built even if we had known how. He described what his intelligence had pieced together about the American Manhattan Project. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Hanford, Washington. Los Alamos, New Mexico. These facilities consumed more electricity than major Japanese cities. They employed 130,000 workers. The Manhattan Project cost $2 billion, more than Japan spent on its entire war effort in 1944. Foreign Minister Togo asked the question everyone was thinking. How could we not know? Sato's answer was uncomfortable, but accurate. We knew, Foreign Minister. Our intelligence services reported on American industrial expansion continuously. We intercepted communications about large-scale secret projects. We documented their scientific recruitment efforts. But every report was dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. We chose not to know because knowing would require acknowledging that we could not win. The day after Hiroshima brought confirmation that made the attack seem even more incomprehensible. Reconnaissance aircraft finally penetrated the radiation zone and transmitted photographs that circulated among the high command within hours. Major Sune Kitamura, the pilot who flew the first successful reconnaissance mission, reported weather conditions he had never encountered. Updrafts so powerful they threw his aircraft 2,000 feet higher in seconds. Air temperatures that spiked his instruments. Visibility obscured by smoke that rose in a column to the stratosphere. The photographs, developed by 11:20 a.m., showed something that military analysts initially refused to believe. The city center, approximately 4 square miles, had been completely flattened. Not destroyed in the conventional sense where rubble and building foundations remained. Flattened to bare earth. Structures had been vaporized. The reconnaissance team estimated that everything within a mile of the blast center had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Intelligence analysts compared these images to conventional bombing results. The most devastating conventional raid of the war, the Tokyo firebombing of March 9–10, 1945, had required 334 B-29 bombers, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 hours. Hiroshima's destruction exceeded that raid's devastation. Accomplished by a single bomb from a single aircraft in a single instant, the Supreme War Council reconvened at 2 p.m. on August 7th. With news that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned Japanese Ambassador Naotaki Sato to the Kremlin at midnight Moscow time. The message was brief. The Soviet Union will consider itself at war with Japan, effective August 9, 1945. This announcement shattered Japan's final strategic hope. For months, Japanese diplomacy had worked desperately to negotiate Soviet mediation for peace terms. The fantasy was that Stalin, never fully trusted by his American and British allies, might broker an arrangement that preserved some Japanese territory and prevented occupation. It was a desperate hope, but it had been the only hope. General Anami's face went pale. Multiple witnesses later recorded his reaction. Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with no prospect of negotiated settlement. American atomic weapons from the east, Soviet armies from the north, British Commonwealth forces from the south, Chinese resistance continuing in occupied territories. The empire that had once stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific was being compressed back toward the home. Islands with crushing force. Foreign Minister. Togo presented the stark reality. We have 3 choices. Surrender unconditionally, fight until every city is destroyed by atomic weapons, or fight until Soviet and American forces invade and Japan ceases to exist as a nation. There are no other options. Late on August 8th brought fragmentary intelligence about Soviet movements that confirmed everyone's worst fears. The Red Army had launched a massive assault into Manchuria with overwhelming force. The Kwantung Army, Once the elite formation of Japanese military power, the army that had conquered Manchuria was being systematically destroyed. Soviet tank columns advanced 50 miles in the first day. Japanese resistance collapsed before forces that had learned their trade destroying Nazi Germany. The Manchurian operation demonstrated another uncomfortable truth about American power. The Soviets were equipped with thousands of American vehicles, trucks, and communications equipment provided through Lend-Lease. American industrial capacity had not only sustained its own forces across two oceans, but had also equipped allies on a scale that seemed impossible by Japanese standards. A single American program, Lend-Lease, had provided more material to Soviet forces than Japan's entire industrial output for the war. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The communication from the Nagasaki Regional Command was even briefer than Hiroshima's. Second atomic attack. City destroyed. Casualties catastrophic. Then silence. The Supreme War, Council emergency session that afternoon, descended into something unprecedented in Japanese military. Protocol, open acknowledgement of complete strategic failure. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai spoke with remarkable candor. The Americans have demonstrated that they can destroy our cities at will, one by one until nothing remains. They have demonstrated the capability to continue this indefinitely. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot detect until they detonate. Our anti-aircraft systems are irrelevant. Our fighter aircraft cannot intercept what they cannot find. Our civil defense preparations are meaningless. Army Chief of Staff General Umezu added his own assessment, one that would have been considered defeatist heresy just weeks earlier. The atomic bomb changes fundamental military calculations. Concentrated forces become targets. Cities become targets. Our strategy of fighting to the last citizen assumes Americans must invade to occupy. But if they can destroy cities without invasion, our entire defensive doctrine becomes obsolete. They can simply eliminate Japan from existence without ever setting foot on our soil. Intelligence. Estimates presented that evening calculated that America likely possessed between 3 and 7 additional atomic bombs, with production capacity for more. Even if this estimate was wrong, even if America possessed only one more weapon, the strategic implication remained identical. Continued resistance was suicide. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu recorded the Emperor's private comments from an audience that evening. His Majesty expressed that the unendurable must be endured. The atomic bombs have demonstrated that continued resistance will result in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept terms that preserve the nation, even if those terms are painful beyond measure. The phrase, "the unendurable must be endured," would become the foundation for Japan's surrender announcement, but the path from this private imperial acknowledgement to actual surrender required navigating military opposition that remained fierce despite overwhelming evidence. The Imperial Conference, convened just before midnight on August 9-2 9-10, joining the Big Six of the Supreme War Council was Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, President of the Privy Council. The divided council members spoke. Notably, Army Chief of Staff Umezu insisted that Soviet entry was unfavorable, but didn't invalidate the plan to defend the home islands. He still believed Japan could inflict such casualties on invading forces that America would negotiate. Hiranuma spoke pointedly of the deterioration of the domestic situation, particularly food supplies. Japan was starving. The naval blockade had been so effective that cities had less than a month's supply of rice. People were eating tree bark and grass. At the end of what witnesses described as a theatrical demonstration of the deadlock, Emperor Hirohito spoke. Participants later recollected that he said, "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing, at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." The emperor had spoken. In Japanese political culture, this ended all debate. But it didn't end the resistance. Between August 10th and August 15th, hardline military officers plotted a coup. They planned to seize the imperial palace, prevent the surrender announcement, and continue the war. The ringleaders included Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Masataka Ida. They believed, genuinely believed, that if they could prevent the surrender broadcast, the military could rally the nation for one final battle. On the night of August 14-15, they struck. They seized control of the imperial palace grounds. They searched frantically for the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement, which had been made earlier that day. If they could destroy the recording before it was broadcast, they could prevent the surrender, but they couldn't find it. The recording had been hidden in a safe in the Imperial Household Ministry's office, inside a stack of documents labeled miscellaneous. The coup collapsed by dawn. Major Hatanaka shot himself on the Imperial Palace Plaza. The recording survived. At noon on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across Japan. Most Japanese people had never heard the emperor's voice. Many didn't understand him. He spoke in formal court Japanese that was barely comprehensible to average citizens. But they understood enough. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. For 21-year-old Akiko Takakura, the bank clerk who had survived, Hiroshima at 300 meters from ground zero. WWII broadcast meant something different than it meant for the generals in their bunker. She had spent 9 days in unimaginable agony. Her back burned so severely that the pattern of her kimono was seared into her skin. She would carry those scars for the rest of her life. When she heard the emperor's voice, she cried, not from relief, not from joy, but from a grief so profound it had no words. The war was over, but what had been lost could never be returned. The formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, brought Japanese representatives face to face with the physical manifestation of American power they had consistently underestimated. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who signed the surrender document, recorded his impressions in his diary. The harbor was filled with American warships as far as one could see. Hundreds of vessels. Aircraft filled the sky in formations that blocked the sun. The Americans displayed their power not through threats, but through simple presence. This armada represented a fraction of their total military force, yet exceeded everything Japan possessed at the peak of our strength. General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Imperial General Staff, noted that the ceremony's location was itself a lesson in American capability. We surrendered aboard a battleship built in American yards in less time than it took us to plan a single naval operation. The Missouri was one of dozens of capital ships they constructed while simultaneously fighting across 2 oceans and developing atomic weapons. We prepared for war for a decade. They prepared for 15 months and buried us. Intelligence Colonel Sato compiled his final report in September 1945, titled Why We Lost. The document provided brutal honesty. We lost the war in December 1941 when we attacked an enemy we did not understand. Every battle thereafter was simply the working out of inevitable mathematics. American industrial capacity exceeded ours by factors of 10 to 20 in every category. Their scientific establishment was larger than our entire educated population. Their resource base was effectively unlimited, while ours depended on conquests we could not sustain. We fought believing spirit could overcome material. We were wrong. The final lesson Japan's high command absorbed was perhaps the bitterest. American power had not been fully deployed. The United States had fought a two-ocean war while maintaining substantial forces in reserve, developing next-generation weapons, and preparing for conflicts that might follow. The atomic bombs represented not America's maximum effort, but what they could accomplish while simultaneously doing a dozen other things. Japanese forces had fought with total commitment of every resource. American forces had fought with comfortable margins everywhere. The women who built the bombs, and here's the part that would have shocked those Japanese generals most if they had known. So, significant portion of the Manhattan Project workforce was women. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, thousands of women operated the Calatrons, massive machines that enriched uranium. Most of them had no idea what they were building. They were told to watch dials and adjust knobs, following procedures they didn't understand. At Hanford, Washington, women worked as chemists, technicians, and engineers on the plutonium production reactors. At Los Alamos, women mathematicians performed the complex calculations needed to design the bomb. They were called computers, human computers, because electronic computers barely existed yet. The irony would have been devastating to Japanese military leaders who believed American women made their society weak. American women helped build the weapon that ended the war. This is the story of what happens when you believe what you want to believe instead of what the evidence shows. Japan's military leadership wasn't stupid. They were intelligent, educated, experienced officers. But they had constructed a worldview built on comfortable lies, and they defended those lies even as reality contradicted them at every turn. They told themselves distance would protect them until American forces island-hopped across the Pacific. They told themselves American society was too soft to fight until American industrial production buried them in materiel. They told themselves spirit could overcome material superiority until a single bomb vaporized AEA City. The atomic bomb didn't defeat Japan. Japan was already defeated. The atomic bomb was simply the final proof. Undeniable, absolute, terrifying. That they had been fighting an enemy they never understood. And that's the lesson worth remembering. In war, in life, in any human endeavor, reality doesn't care about your beliefs. It doesn't matter how much spirit you have, how dedicated you are, how pure your intentions might be. Sometimes you're just wrong. And the sooner you face that truth, the less it will cost you. When American forces began landing in Japan in late August 1945, Japanese military observers were assigned to document the arrival. What they saw confirmed every nightmare calculation they'd made too late. Captain Yoshiko Hasegawa was one of the few women serving in Japanese military intelligence. She had spent the war analyzing intercepted American communications, trying to piece together accurate assessments of enemy capability. Most of her reports had been dismissed as pessimistic. Now, standing at Atsugi Airfield watching American troops arrive, she kept a detailed diary that would later be preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies. August 28, 1945. The Americans arrived with a precision that demonstrated everything we failed to understand. A single infantry company moved with more vehicles than I had seen in my entire career. Every soldier carried equipment we could barely manufacture for our elite units. They set up field kitchens that served hot meals within an hour of landing. Hot meals. Our soldiers in Manchuria were starving, and these Americans were eating steak. August the 30th, 1945. General MacArthur arrived today. I counted the aircraft in his escort formation. 27 fighters. For a single general's transport. We could not have mustered 27 operational fighters for the defense of Tokyo. September 2nd, 1945. I watched the surrender ceremony from a distance. The Missouri is larger than any ship I have ever seen. But what struck me was not the ship. It was what surrounded it. The harbor was so filled with American vessels that I could not see water between them. Admiral Toyota told me we sank over 200 American ships during the war. Looking at this armada, I realize now that we were fighting an enemy for whom 200 ships was barely an inconvenience. The American Occupation Administration, led by General MacArthur, made a deliberate choice that would prove psychologically devastating to Japan's former military leadership. They provided Japanese officials with complete, accurate data about American war production. This wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. MacArthur understood that Japan's future cooperation required them to fully comprehend why resistance had been futile. In October 1945, Colonel Sato, the intelligence officer who had tried to warn his superiors, was given access to official U.S. War Production Board statistics. He spent 3 days reviewing the documents. His staff watched him work in silence, occasionally seeing him put his head in his hands. The final report he compiled was titled, "The Mathematics of Our Defeat." It was 47 pages of cold numbers that told a story of industrial annihilation. Aircraft production, 1941-1945. United States, 324,750 aircraft. Japan, 76,320 aircraft. The Americans had produced more than 4 times as many planes. But it was worse than the ratio suggested. American aircraft were, on average, larger, more sophisticated, and longer-ranged than Japanese equivalents. Naval vessels. United States, 141 aircraft carriers, all types. Japan, 16 aircraft carriers, all types. After Midway, when Japan lost 4 carriers in June 1942, it took them the rest of the war to build 6 replacements. The United States built 17 carriers in the same period. Merchant shipping. This was where the numbers became almost incomprehensible. United States built 993,000 tons of merchant shipping. Japan built 452,000 tons of merchant shipping. Sato did the calculation multiple times because he couldn't believe it. The United States had built more merchant shipping in the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan built in the entire 7 years of the war. And here's what made it worse. The United States was simultaneously replacing ships faster than German U-boats could sink them in the Atlantic. Japan was fighting 1 war. America was fighting 2, and outbuilding both enemies combined. What particularly struck Yoshiko Hasegawa, the female intelligence officer, was learning about the American women who had powered this industrial miracle. The occupation forces brought documentary films to show Japanese audiences what America had mobilized. One film focused on the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. Hasegawa wrote about watching this film. They showed us women building ships, not assisting, building, welding hulls, operating cranes, reading blueprints. The film stated that 27% of the Kaiser workforce was female. That was over 90,000 women in a single shipyard complex. I tried to imagine 90,000 Japanese women working in heavy industry. It was impossible to picture. Not because Japanese women lack capability, but because our society would never have permitted it. We told ourselves this made us stronger, that American dependence on women proved their weakness. We were wrong. Their willingness to mobilize every capable person, regardless of gender, gave them access to twice the workforce we could muster. While we insisted women stay home, American women were building the bombers that destroyed our cities. The most famous American woman in shipbuilding was a welder named Wendy the Welder, the real-life inspiration for Rosie the Riveter. But there were millions of others whose names were never recorded. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford built B-24 bombers, Women made up 40% of the workforce. These weren't simple assembly jobs. Women were reading complex engineering, diagrams, operating precision machinery, and performing quality control on aircraft that would fly into combat. One B-24 VT-24 bomber had 150,000 parts. Willow Run was producing one complete bomber every 63 minutes. Much of that work was done by women who, 2 years earlier, had been housewives. In November 1945, Japanese scientists were invited to tour what remained of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The purpose was scientific assessment, but it became something else entirely. A confrontation with the absolute supremacy of American physics. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had led Japan's own atomic bomb research program during the war. It had been a tiny effort. Fewer than 100 scientists, minimal funding, almost no progress. Nishina had always known it was hopeless, but he'd never fully understood why until he saw the aftermath of Hiroshima. His report, written in December 1945, contained this passage. I had believed that the atomic bomb was theoretically possible, but practically impossible, that the industrial requirements were so vast that no nation could accomplish it while simultaneously fighting a war. I was correct about the industrial requirements. I was wrong about American capability. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima required enriching uranium to unprecedented purity. This requires thousands of centrifuges operating continuously for months. The electrical power consumption alone would have exceeded Japan's entire national grid capacity. The United States built this facility, Oak Ridge, as a side project while fighting on 2 fronts. We had 100 scientists. They had 130,000 people working on the Manhattan Project. We had one small laboratory. They built 3 entire cities in secret. The scale difference is so vast that comparison becomes meaningless. Another Japanese physicist, Dr. Hideki Yukawa, who would later win the Nobel Prize, put it more bluntly in a private letter to a colleague. We were playing with fire. They were commanding it. General Korechika Anami, the war minister who had argued most vociferously for fighting to the last citizen, spent the night of August 14th writing letters. He knew the surrender broadcast would air the next day. He knew his position had become untenable, and he knew what he had to do. His final letter to his son, discovered after his death, contained a passage that revealed his internal transformation. I opposed surrender because I believed our spirit could overcome their material advantages. I believed that our willingness to die would break their will to fight. I believed that a nation of shopkeepers could never defeat a nation of warriors. I was wrong about everything. The Americans did not break because they were never fragile. They were patient. They built weapons we could not imagine while we were congratulating ourselves on our fighting spirit. They mobilized their entire society, including their women, while we clung to traditions that limited our strength. A true warrior acknowledges when he has been defeated. I have been defeated not just in battle, but in understanding. I could not protect Japan because I never understood what we faced. Early on the morning of August 15th, just hours before the Emperor's broadcast, General Anami committed seppuku, ritual suicide. His death was not an act of cowardice, but of taking responsibility for his failure. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, took a different path. Unlike Anami, Yonai had quietly opposed the war from the beginning. He had served as prime minister in 1940 and had been forced out by the army because of his reluctance to align with Germany. But he had kept his doubts largely private, knowing that speaking too openly risked assassination. After the surrender, Yonai became one of the most vocal advocates for Japan's complete demilitarization and democratization. In interviews with American occupation historians in 1946, he articulated what he had learned. The Emperor asked me why the Navy had not opposed the war more vigorously if we knew it was unwinnable. I had no good answer. We knew. Admiral Yamamoto knew. Our intelligence services knew, but we were trapped by a culture that made honesty about our weaknesses equivalent to treason. The Americans defeated us with production, but they conquered us with a different kind of strength. The strength to question themselves. Their democracy allowed debate, dissent, and change. Our system demanded unanimity and punished doubt. This is why they grew stronger while we grew weaker. Yoni would live until 1948, spending his final years arguing that Japan's military culture had been not just defeated, but wrong, morally, strategically, and philosophically. While military leaders grappled with strategic failure, the women of Hiroshima faced a different kind of reckoning. Akiko Takakura, the bank clerk who survived at 300 meters, spent months in a makeshift hospital. The pattern of her kimono was permanently burned into her back. Her hair fell out. Her skin blistered and bled. She kept a diary during her recovery. Excerpts were published decades later. August 20th, 1945. A nurse told me today that the war is over. I felt nothing. What does over mean when everything is already destroyed? September 3rd, 1945. I learned that a single bomb did this. One bomb. My mind cannot accept this. How can one bomb kill 80,000 people? The nurse says it was a new type of weapon. A special bomb. I asked if the Americans have more of these special bombs. She didn't answer. October 12th, 1945. I saw myself in a mirror today for the first time since the bomb. I cried for an hour. The woman looking back at me is not the woman I was. My face is scarred. My back is ruined. But worse than the physical scars is knowing that a weapon exists that can do this, and knowing that my country made the Americans angry enough to use it. Thousands of women in Hiroshima and Nagasaki became known as hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors. They carried physical scars, but also a unique burden. They had experienced something that had never happened before in human history. Many hibakusha women faced discrimination in Japanese society. Potential husbands rejected them, fearing their radiation exposure would produce deformed children. Employers refused to hire them. They became living reminders of Japan's defeat. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki captured global attention, another catastrophe unfolded in Manchuria that demonstrated the completeness of Japan's strategic collapse. When the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria on August 9th, approximately 1.6 million Japanese civilians were living there. Colonists who had moved to Manchuria over the previous decade as part of Japan's imperial expansion, the Kwantung Army, the force supposedly protecting these civilians, collapsed within days. Soviet forces advanced so rapidly that Japanese military units simply disintegrated. What followed was a humanitarian disaster that Japanese authorities tried to hide for decades. Thousands of Japanese civilians, mostly women and children, the men had been conscripted, were abandoned by their military. They fled southward, trying to reach ports for evacuation to Japan. Fukue Nukaga was 16 years old when the Soviets invaded. She was living with her mother and two younger sisters in Harbin. Her diary, discovered in the 1980s, provides a ground-level view of the collapse. August 10th. Father left with the army this morning. He said they were going to delay the Soviets to give us time to evacuate. I haven't seen him since. August 14th. We're walking south. Mother says we have to reach Dalian. That's 800 kilometers. I don't think we'll make it. Already I've seen dozens of bodies by the roadside. People who couldn't keep walking. August 22nd. We met a group of Japanese soldiers. I thought they would help us. Instead, they took our food and left. One soldier told us, "The army cannot help civilians anymore. The war is over. You must survive on your own." September 1st. My younger sister died last night. Starvation. Mother and I buried her by the road and kept walking. We have no choice. Tens of thousands of Japanese civilians died in Manchuria during the evacuation. Thousands more were captured by Soviet forces or Chinese guerrillas. Many women were assaulted. Children were abandoned or orphaned. The Manchurian catastrophe revealed something the atomic bombs had already proven. Japan's military had promised to protect its people and had failed utterly. The empire had expanded too far, mobilized too recklessly, and when defeat came, the military could not even organize an orderly retreat. In early 1946, the American occupation authorities organized tours of American industrial facilities for selected Japanese officials. The goal was educational, to help Japanese understand modern industrial techniques that might aid reconstruction. But for the Japanese visitors, these tours became another confrontation with the scale of what they had fought against. Kenzo Matsumura, a former Japanese Ministry of Munitions official, was part of a delegation that toured American automotive plants in Detroit in March 1946. His report, filed with the occupation authorities, reads like a confession. I visited the Ford River Rouge complex. It is not a factory. It is a city dedicated to production. Iron ore enters at one end. Finished automobiles exit at the other. The entire process, from raw materials to finished product, occurs in a single integrated facility. The complex employs 100,000 workers. During the war, it produced one bomber every 63 minutes, plus tanks, jeeps, and engines. I asked our guide how they achieved such production. He said, assembly line integration and worker efficiency. These words mean nothing until you see it. I calculated that this single American factory complex had greater production capacity than our entire national heavy industry sector. And Ford had dozens of facilities. We were competing against dozens of River Rouge complexes, while we could barely maintain one comparable operation. Perhaps nothing demonstrated American industrial supremacy more clearly than the Liberty Ship program. Liberty? Ships were cargo vessels designed to be built quickly and cheaply to replace merchant shipping losses in the Atlantic. The ships were not sophisticated. They were welded rather than riveted, used prefabricated sections, and prioritized speed of construction over elegance. But the numbers were staggering. The United States built 2,610 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. At peak production, American shipyards were completing 3 Liberty ships per day. The fastest construction time for a single Liberty ship was 4 days and 15.5 hours. From laying the keel to launching a complete functional cargo vessel. When Japanese naval architects were shown these statistics during the occupation, many initially refused to believe them. It seemed physically impossible. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, wrote in his memoir, I sank perhaps a dozen American merchant ships during the war. At the time, I thought we were inflicting irreplaceable losses. Learning that the Americans built 3 ships per day makes me realize that nothing we did mattered. We were insects biting an elephant. During the occupation, detailed American employment statistics were shared with Japanese officials. The numbers regarding women's participation shocked Japanese observers. In 1944, at the peak of American war production, 10 million American women were employed in the workforce, up from 12 million in 1940. Women comprised 36% of the total civilian workforce in aircraft manufacturing specifically. Women were 40% of workers in shipbuilding. 27% of workers were women in ammunition production. 45% of workers were women. Yoshiko Hasegawa, the intelligence officer, compiled a comparison report. If Japan had mobilized women at the same rate as America, we would have added approximately 8 million workers to our industrial base. This alone might have doubled our production capacity, but cultural resistance made this impossible. We told ourselves that women's place was in the home, raising future soldiers. Meanwhile, American women were building the actual weapons that defeated those soldiers. The Americans understood something we did not. In total war, every capable person must contribute. Gender is irrelevant when survival is at stake. One statistic that particularly devastated Japanese officials was food production. During the war, Japan had experienced severe food shortages. By 1945, urban populations were near starvation. Rice rations had been cut to barely subsistence levels. People were eating acorns, grass, and sawdust mixed with flour to survive. American forces, in contrast, had been well fed throughout the war. A single American aircraft carrier consumed 12,000 meals per day. The menu included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, dairy products, and desserts. On Thanksgiving 1944, American forces in the Pacific were served turkey dinners. The United States produced so much food that it supplied not only its own forces, but also provided substantial food aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. Former Prime Minister Suzuki, in a conversation recorded by occupation historians, said, "We asked our people to endure hunger for the empire. They endured. But the Americans never asked their people to go hungry. They fed their soldiers better than we fed our generals." This is the difference between a rich nation and a poor nation. Pretending to be rich. Perhaps the most damning statistic was oil. Japan's entire strategic gamble in going to war had been based on securing oil from the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo in 1941 had been seen as an existential threat that justified war. By 1945, Japan's oil situation was catastrophic. The combined fleet had been largely immobilized for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat unused because there was no aviation fuel. Training for new pilots had been cut to minimal levels because they couldn't afford to waste gasoline. The United States, meanwhile, had oil reserves that were effectively unlimited. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 1.5 billion barrels of oil. American forces consumed fuel at rates that would have bankrupted Japan's entire economy. A single American carrier task force consumed 6,000 barrels of fuel per day during normal operations, more during combat. The United States operated dozens of such task forces. Simultaneously, Colonel Sato calculated that American naval forces alone consumed more oil in 1 month than Japan's entire military had consumed in a year. "We went to war to secure oil," he wrote. "We lost because our enemy had so much oil that our conquest was meaningless. They could waste more fuel than we could capture." In 1948, 3 years after the surrender, a symposium was held in Tokyo where former military leaders, occupation officials, and historians discussed the question, why did Japan lose? The transcript of this symposium, preserved in the National Archives, reveals the final clarity that Japanese leadership had achieved. Admiral Toyoda spoke first. "We lost because we began the war believing 3 lies. First, that distance would protect us. But distance meant nothing against an enemy with unlimited range. Second, that American society was weak, but their democracy proved stronger than our autocracy because it allowed them to mobilize more effectively. Third, that spirit could overcome material. But courage is meaningless against industrial supremacy of the scale America possessed." General Umezu added, "The atomic bomb did not defeat us. We were already defeated. The bomb simply made our defeat visible in a way we could no longer deny. A single weapon that could destroy a city revealed that we had been fighting an enemy whose scientific and industrial capacity existed on a different level than ours. We told ourselves we were fighting the United States. We were not. We were fighting the entire economic and scientific output of the most advanced industrial civilization in human history. It was like a village militia declaring war on an empire." But perhaps the most profound observation came from Yoshiko Hasegawa, the intelligence officer who was one of the few women invited to speak. "The Americans did not defeat us with atomic bombs or battleships or bombers. They defeated us with something simpler. They used all their resources, and we used only half of ours. They mobilized women. We confined ours to domestic roles. They leveraged diversity. We demanded conformity. They rewarded innovation. We punished dissent. Japan had brilliant scientists, capable women, innovative thinkers. But our culture suppressed them, while America's culture unleashed them. We lost not because American people were superior, but because American society was more effective at utilizing the talents of all its people. General MacArthur's occupation imposed dramatic changes on Japanese society. Women received the right to vote. The military was abolished. The education system was reformed. Zaibatsu monopolies were broken up. Many of these changes were resented at first, but within a generation, they would transform Japan into an economic superpower. By the 1960s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy. Japanese cars, electronics, and machinery were competing globally. The same nation that had lost the war through industrial inadequacy became an industrial giant. But the foundation for that transformation was laid during the occupation, when Japanese leaders were forced to confront not just their military defeat, but their systemic failures. Akiko Takakura, the Hiroshima survivor, lived until 2015. In her final years, she spoke frequently to school groups about her experience. Her message was always the same. I do not speak about the atomic bomb to make you hate America. I speak about it to teach you what war costs. The young men who dropped that bomb were not evil. They were following orders in a war Japan started. The real lesson is this: leaders who lie to themselves will lead their people to destruction. Our leaders told themselves comfortable lies about American weakness, about Japanese superiority, about fighting spirit, overcoming reality. Those lies killed 80,000 people in Hiroshima in an instant, and millions more throughout the war. The truth is always painful, but lies are deadly. One final story deserves telling. In 1952, 7 years after the surrender, a group of American women who had worked on the Manhattan Project visited Japan as part of a scientific exchange program. Among them was a woman named Margaret Mackay, who had worked as a chemist at Los Alamos. She met with Yoshiko Hasegawa, the former intelligence officer. Their conversation, recorded in Mackay's diary, is remarkable. Mackay: I've felt guilty since the war ended. I helped build the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima. Hasegawa: I have felt guilty that my intelligence reports were ignored. If my superiors had listened, perhaps we would have surrendered sooner, and Hiroshima would have been spared. Mackay: How can you not hate me? Hate us? Hasegawa: Because hatred is another comfortable lie. You did not drop the bomb out of cruelty. You built it because your country mobilized everyone, including women like you, to end a war that was killing thousands of people every day it continued. Hasegawa: My country told women to stay home and raise soldiers. Your country put women in laboratories and factories. In the end, that difference mattered more than any battle. This conversation between two women, one who helped build the bomb, one who tried to prevent the war, captured something profound about what had really happened. The story of August 6, 1945, extends far beyond the moment the bomb fell. It's about what led to that moment and what came after. In the years following the surrender, Japan underwent one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. The occupation, initially resented, brought changes that would revolutionize Japanese society. Women's suffrage was granted in December 1945. In the first election where women could vote, held in April 1946, 39 women were elected to the Diet, Japan's parliament. This was higher than the percentage of women in the U.S. Congress at the time. Yoshiko Hasegawa, the intelligence officer, ran for office in 1947. She lost, but her campaign speeches were recorded and preserved. In one, she said, I spent the war analyzing American capabilities. I saw the reports about their women working in factories, their diversity, their democracy. I reported these facts to my superiors. They dismissed them as weaknesses. Now I understand these were their greatest strengths. If Japan is to rebuild, we must learn from our defeat. We must mobilize everyone, not just men, not just the elite, but every capable person regardless of gender or background. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. By 1968, just 23 years after the surrender, Japan had become the second-largest economy in the world. Japanese companies like Sony, Toyota, and Honda became global leaders. But this success was built on the lessons learned from defeat. Japanese manufacturers studied American production techniques obsessively. They sent delegations to Detroit, to Boeing, to General Electric. They learned about quality control, assembly line efficiency, worker empowerment. Ironically, Japan became so good at American-style manufacturing that by the 1980s, Japanese cars were outselling American cars in America itself. The women of Hiroshima, meanwhile, carried their scars into a different future. Akiko Takakura became a peace activist in her later years. She spoke at schools, museums, and international conferences. She showed her scars, the kimono pattern still visible on her back 70 years later. In 2010, at age 85, she spoke at the United Nations. Her speech included this passage: "People ask me if I hate Americans. I tell them no. The Americans did not wake up one morning and decide to kill 80,000 innocent people for pleasure. They built a terrible weapon to end a terrible war that Japan started. If you want to blame someone, blame the leaders who started a war they could not win. Blame the system that made questioning authority equivalent to treason. Blame the culture that valued death over surrender, spirit over reality, pride over wisdom. I survived Hiroshima. But I could not truly live until I stopped hating and started learning. The bomb taught humanity what weapons we are capable of building. My life's work has been teaching what wisdom we must have to never use them again." The Manhattan Project women had their own reckoning. Many struggled with guilt for decades. They had helped build a weapon that killed tens of thousands of civilians. The fact that it ended the war didn't erase that burden. Dr. Leona Woods, one of the few female physicists who worked directly on the bomb's core technology, wrote in her memoir, "We were young, brilliant, and arrogant. We thought we were saving the world. Perhaps we did, but we also created the means to destroy it." Every physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project carries this duality. We ended one war and started a new kind of fear that will never end. Other women found meaning in their work differently. Rosie the Riveter, or rather the thousands of real women she represented, saw their wartime factory work as liberation. Many didn't want to return to domestic life when the war ended. They had proven they could do men's work and do it well. The post-war period saw the beginning of modern feminism, partly because millions of women had experienced economic independence and meaningful work during the war. They had welded ships, built bombers, managed factories. Going back to being housewives felt like a step backward. This created tension in American society that wouldn't fully resolve for another generation. But the seeds of change had been planted by the same mobilization that defeated Japan. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, absorbed its own lessons from the war. Stalin had seen what American industrial capacity could accomplish. The Manhattan Project particularly terrified Soviet leadership, not just because of the bomb itself, but because it demonstrated that America could mobilize science on a scale the USSR couldn't match. This sparked the Cold War arms race. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, much sooner than American intelligence had predicted. They achieved this partly through espionage, partly through their own scientific capabilities, but primarily through an all-out national effort that prioritized weapons development above everything else. The nuclear age that followed shaped the next 70 years of human history. The world came close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in WWII 1962. Both the United States and USSR built arsenals capable of destroying civilization multiple times over, but they never used them. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki served as a permanent reminder of what nuclear weapons actually do. It's one thing to possess abstract destructive power. It's another to have photographs of shadows burned into concrete, of a city turned to ash in seconds. Perhaps that's the final lesson of August 6, 1945. Sometimes the most terrible weapons prevent the worst wars. Nuclear weapons haven't been used in combat since Nagasaki, not because humans became more peaceful, but because the consequences became too clear to ignore. Akiko Takakura represented this paradox. She was a victim of nuclear warfare who spent her life arguing that the bomb's existence and the horror it created might be the only thing preventing its use again. In one of her final interviews, before her death in 2015, she said, "I am 90 years old. I have lived 70 years since the bomb. 70 years is longer than most humans in history ever lived. I have seen Japan rise from ashes to prosperity. I have seen former enemies become friends. I have seen the world learn, slowly and imperfectly, that some weapons are too terrible to use. The pattern burned into my back reminds me every day of what happened. But it also reminds me that humans can survive even the worst we do to each other. We can learn. We can change. We can choose differently." The leaders in that bunker beneath Tokyo, reading the message about Hiroshima, finally saw the truth they had denied for years. It cost hundreds of thousands of lives to teach them that lesson. Let us honor those lives by never forgetting what they taught us. The story of Japan's realization, that moment in the bunker when the lies they had told themselves finally collapsed, is ultimately a story about human nature. We all construct narratives that make us comfortable. We dismiss evidence that contradicts what we want to believe. We surround ourselves with people who confirm our biases. We mistake our own propaganda for truth. Japan's military leadership did this at a national level with catastrophic consequences. But the same psychological mechanisms operate in our individual lives every day. How many opportunities do we miss because we refuse to see our own limitations? How many relationships fail because we won't acknowledge uncomfortable truths? How many projects collapse because we believed our own optimistic projections rather than confronting reality? The atomic bomb was just the final, undeniable piece of evidence that shattered Japan's comfortable delusions. But the delusions themselves were the real problem. The bomb just made them impossible to maintain. In our own lives, we rarely get such definitive wake-up calls. Our self-deceptions usually crumble more slowly, through accumulated small failures rather than one catastrophic event. But the lesson remains the same. Face reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Question your assumptions, especially the ones that make you comfortable. Listen to evidence that contradicts your beliefs. Accept that you might be wrong about fundamental things. This doesn't mean abandoning confidence or determination. The Americans who built the atomic bomb had tremendous confidence in their scientific and industrial capabilities. But their confidence was based on accurate assessment of their strengths, not on denying their enemies' capabilities or on believing that fighting spirit alone would overcome material reality. They respected what they were up against. They planned accordingly. They mobilized completely. They innovated constantly. And they won. Japan's leaders, in contrast, confused arrogance for confidence. They believed what they wanted to believe. They suppressed dissenting voices. They prioritized cultural orthodoxy over practical effectiveness. And they lost. The difference wasn't intelligence or dedication or courage. Both sides had all of these. The difference was honesty, the willingness to see reality clearly and adapt accordingly. This is the lesson that Yoshiko Hasegawa, the intelligence officer, tried to teach post-war Japan. This is what Akiko Takakura, the survivor, spent 70 years explaining to students. This is what Admiral Yonai concluded in his final years. The atomic bomb didn't defeat Japan. Japan defeated itself by refusing to acknowledge reality until reality became impossible to ignore. And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're running a nation, managing a business, maintaining a relationship, or just trying to live an honest life. Reality is patient. It will wait for you to acknowledge it. But the longer you delay, the higher the price when truth finally forces itself into your awareness. Sometimes that price is an argument. Sometimes it's a failed project. Sometimes it's a destroyed relationship. And sometimes, in the most tragic cases, it's 80,000 people killed in an instant, and a nation forced to confront that they were wrong about everything. August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. A single flash, a mushroom cloud, a transmission that ended mid-sentence, and in an underground bunker in Tokyo, the moment when comfortable lies met undeniable truth. That's the real story of Hiroshima. Not just what the bomb did, but what it revealed, and what we can learn from the moment when Japan finally realized they never stood a chance because they never truly understood what they were fighting against. The war was already lost. The atomic bomb just made it visible.